Thank you so much for being here. I'm Stephen Prager. I'm the director of the Appleton-Whittell Research Ranch. And we are here today to hear from one of our research ranch fellows, Emma Sudbeck, about her work on the American bullfrog, one of our largest conservation challenges here on the research ranch. We're so excited to have everyone here. We were talking backstage a little bit about how the Research Ranch Fellowship has been kind of operating in the dark for so many years, and we're just so excited to be able to celebrate the young scientists that come our way each and every year, and to let them share some of the good work that they're doing here at the Research Ranch. So just a little bit about the fellowship before we jump to Emma. The Research Ranch Fellowship was launched in 2010, and each year it allows us to recruit 3 research fellows. These fellows are young conservation-focused scientists between the ages of 18 and 30, looking to do research in southeastern Arizona that will help us reach our goals of protecting habitat, protecting birds and other wildlife in the places that they need. Each fellow receives a $1,000 cash award to support their research, a $500 housing voucher, which gives them about 2 weeks worth of stays here at the Research Ranch, and then communication support to help them share their work, including the webinar that y'all are participating in right now. The application window usually opens in early February, and it closes in late March. So if you are a scientist looking to take advantage of this program, or if you know somebody who might want to do some work on the Research Ranch, keep your eye open early next year. So, of course, the reason you are here is to learn a little bit more about what has been keeping our fellows busy this field season. And to help us dive into that, I am going to hand it over to Emma Sudbeck. She is a graduate student with the University of Arizona, working on unraveling some questions around the natural history of American bullfrogs. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to you, Emma.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm really excited for this opportunity to be able to talk to you all today. So let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, everything look okay? Cool. All right, cool. So I'll get started. So yeah, my name is Emma Sudbeck. I am a second-year master's student at the University of Arizona. And today I'm going to be talking to you about my master's thesis research, which is the population ecology of the invasive American bullfrog in Southeast Arizona. So to start off with a little bit about our main character for the day, the American bullfrog. They are native to Eastern North America. This is most of the East Coast or just the Eastern United States, and then a little bit of the Southeast in Canada. They are the largest frog in North America. They can get up to lengths of about 8 inches, which is quite a big frog. In terms of when you're looking at a frog and you're trying to identify whether it's a bullfrog or a leopard frog or any of the other native amphibians in the area, bullfrogs usually tend to be anywhere from a brown to a green coloration. This kind of depends on the habitat they're in as well as the region that you might be looking at them in. But sometimes they will, although they're kind of like drab looking, they sometimes have a mottling pattern, I like to say, which kind of looks like splotches all over their body. This can be on the back of them or also on the front. Another distinguishing characteristic about the bullfrogs is that typically they'll have a very large tympanum. The tympanum is this right here. This is their eardrum. And bullfrogs tend to have a very large one. It's going to be a lot larger than their eye. This is not always the best thing to look at just because the male bullfrogs are the ones that are going to have huge tympanums, and female bullfrogs have kind of a tympanum that's around the same size as their eye. But definitely if you see a large tympanum on a frog, then it's probably a bullfrog. Another unique feature to these guys is that they have a very unique call in comparison to any of the other amphibians in this area, especially. It's a very deep call, kind of like a juggarum. A lot of people like to say that it also kind of sounds like a bull, as their name kind of implies, a cow. And my evidence for this is that when I was doing some acoustic monitoring, not for this project, but for a different one, it was very hard to train the program to actually distinguish between a cow calling and a bullfrog calling. So if you hear something that sounds like a weird cow, it's probably a bullfrog. So this is kind of just a slide to further show the differences between a bullfrog and then a native leopard frog in the area. So this is a lowland leopard frog, one of the native amphibians here in Southeast Arizona. So you can definitely see a big difference is the patterning. The leopard frogs have those very unique spots. They also have this fold here, which is called the dorsolateral fold. You can see that the bullfrogs do not have a fold like that. So if you're looking at maybe just like a head of a frog in the water and you see that dorsolateral line right behind their eye, it's very likely a leopard frog. All right, I also want to talk quickly about their tadpoles. In case you're at a pond in your backyard or something, and you're trying to figure out whether you have bullfrog tadpoles or native amphibian tadpoles. So typically, if you see a very large tadpole that's about the size of the palm of your hand or a golf ball, this is going to be a bullfrog tadpole. This is because they overwinter for multiple years, or they can overwinter for multiple years, so they tend to grow a lot larger than the native amphibians in the area. But you know, at different stages of development, they're going to be the same size as other frog tadpoles like leopard frogs. So definitely a unique characteristic when you're looking at these guys is the tiny uniform black dots that are all over their body, which you can kind of see in these pictures. I always like to say it looks like somebody took a fine point Sharpie and just kind of dotted along the back and the side of the tadpoles. And that's how you can tell. So this is a little comparison between a bullfrog tadpole and this is a northern leopard frog tadpole, which is also native in Arizona, but not Southeast. So you can definitely see the distinguishing characteristic between these two, although they are the same size, is those very uniform black dots on the bullfrog tadpole. The leopard frog looks a little bit more marbled in color and doesn't have those black dots. So it's a good distinguishing characteristic. It is hard to tell the difference between tadpoles in terms of like but distinguishing between leopard frogs and toads. So I won't get into that, but if you're looking for a bullfrog tadpole, this is how you know. So a little bit about their life history to kind of think about while I'm going through this presentation. Bullfrogs are a mostly aquatic species. They do require water, pretty permanent water. If you see them, they tend to be in the water as well. They're not as much of a terrestrial species as many toads are. Like all amphibians, they do require permanent water to breed because amphibians in general lay eggs in the water. And then those eggs become tadpoles, which live in the water. And then bullfrogs in particular, like I kind of mentioned earlier, their tadpoles overwinter. So they need permanent water that's going to be around for multiple years to be able to reach metamorphosis and become juvenile frogs. So for bullfrogs, this can take metamorphosis can take 1 to 2 years. In other regions where it's a little bit where they have more reliable water, it can take 3 to 4 years as well. That's why they get so huge. Bullfrogs can also in the wild live for like 5 to 10 years. So if you see a really massive bullfrog, it's probably pretty old. Okay, so in the early 1900s, around the 1920s, was when bullfrogs were taken from their native range and introduced into the Western United States, into various states like Arizona and Colorado, California, etc. They were introduced originally on purpose. A lot of people liked to hunt them. They were an important game species back in the early 1900s. People liked to harvest their frog legs for consumption. It's kind of almost a delicacy back in the day, which I think we should bring back because that would kind of solve quite a few problems, but we'll see if that happens. But nonetheless, they were introduced first that way into many water bodies. And then without any natural predators in the system, they were able to just kind of invade and take over a lot of water systems. They also were further spread on accident by state agencies when people are rearing fish in fish hatcheries. They have raceways that are just open, and bullfrogs were coming in, breeding in the raceways at the fish hatcheries. And then when the agencies stocked fish into various water bodies, they were also stocking bullfrog tadpoles. So that was the catalyst to this whole invasion. I do also want to mention that the line between their invasive versus their native range is highly debated. You can kind of see, but with this map, where their native range, which is the orange, and then invasive range in the maroon, it almost touches in a lot of places that are right in the center of their native versus non-native range map. This is extremely confusing because how could you know that they're invasive just in the next watershed over versus one, yeah, right next to each other. So it is highly debated, and I think in a lot of places in that center line still consider them invasive, but it's definitely poses a challenge. So bullfrogs not only were introduced into the Western United States, but they were actually introduced worldwide. They were introduced into various countries, most notably Brazil, Japan, Indonesia, China, Haitian Islands, and then even in Europe, like Belgium and Germany and France. They are posing a problem all over in these places because, again, they don't have natural predators. They are only native to Eastern United States or Eastern North America. So countries all over the world are dealing with the issues of bullfrogs and also attempting to combat them. So I see a lot of research happening in these other countries, which is pretty cool. So hopefully we can all learn together. So the Southwest, in particular, provides a very unique ecosystem for amphibians in particular. There's not a lot of water in the Southwest, right? There's not many flowing rivers, especially down in the desert parts. So a lot of the reliable water sources actually come from cattle stock tanks. These are just kind of indents in the ground, usually mud pits that are filled up for cattle that are on the rangeland in a lot of these non-urban areas. And these are usually filled up with well water if they are more permanent water sources for cattle to have water throughout the year. Some of them are also dry during some parts of the year and then only fill up during the monsoon season. So there's a lot of variability in terms of the hydro period here, but cattle stock tanks are definitely the main place where amphibians are breeding and living. Another unique part about the Southwest is that we have different seasons here, and although it's warm throughout the year, it does get a little bit cold in the winter, but for the most part, it's quite warm. But we do have different precipitation seasons. So there's a dry season, and I've only been here for a year, so I'm just going off from what I know. But the dry season, which is usually like mid-spring, and then it goes right until the beginning of the monsoon season in about late June. And then a little bit after the monsoon season, like kind of right now we seem to be in a dry season. There are winter rains in the Southwest, which occur during the winter, so like December through I think February, when it is a little bit colder. And then we have the beloved monsoon season. Monsoon season is during the summer, so it's about late June until September. And this is definitely when a lot of amphibians kind of wait to breed because they know that there's going to be that reliable water source. And the monsoon seasons, they do kind of vary in terms of whether it was a good monsoon season or a bad one, but the amphibians seem to wait for this period of time nonetheless. And because the monsoon season provides a lot of rain and it is warmer, it is thought that amphibians disperse during this monsoon season because there's more relative humidity during this time. Ponds are filling up so they can have places to kind of move through with water so they aren't drying out. So this is definitely a time that we were looking at. And most of the knowledge that we know about bullfrog ecology, especially in their invasive range, it comes from more temperate regions where there's a little bit more reliable water sources and just a different ecosystem overall. So in the Southwest in particular, there's definitely some knowledge gaps in the published research that's available. So my project is definitely hoping to kind of fill those knowledge gaps to be able to share what we know about this unique ecosystem and how bullfrogs are functioning in it. Yeah, we had it published. So we talked a lot about bullfrogs, and hopefully some of you know that bullfrogs are a huge conservation concern and know a little bit about why. But if you don't, I'm going to go into a little bit about why they are such a problem and why they're so good at being an invasive species. So there's four primary mechanisms for this. The first one is that they spread disease to native amphibians in the area. There are two amphibian diseases going around right now. First one is chytrid fungus. This is a fungal disease that affects the skin of amphibians, usually causes skin lesions and just causes them to be lethargic and sickly, so they're not able to usually survive when they get this fungus. And then ranavirus, similarly, another disease that affects the frogs, and they kind of get these red legs, like you can see in the picture on the right. These two are very terrible diseases that live in the water. They're leading causes of amphibian decline. They've been leading causes of amphibian declines for decades now. But bullfrogs in particular are a problem for this because they are reservoirs for both of these diseases. So they can contract these diseases and hold them within their system. And then once they invade a new area, they just spread it to the native amphibians or anything else that's in the system that they go to, and they aren't affected by it themselves. So this causes a really easy way for them to outcompete anything else that's in the system with them. Bullfrogs are also voracious predators. Cecil Schwalbe used to call them the great white sharks of the inland waters, which is very fitting. They are a generalist species, so they will pretty much eat anything that fits into their mouth, that moves or doesn't move, honestly. And you can see even they eat each other by this picture on the right that I took this year. This was actually when we were doing the study, we put all of the frogs that are being processed in the same laundry basket, so before we release them. And apparently these ones just had a problem with each other or something, and he ended up in this guy's mouth. But we did toe clip them, so we did eventually pry out the frog from the mouth of this bullfrog because that's data and I need data. So just a fun story for you. But other things that they have been documented to eat in Arizona is Sonoran mud turtles, which is native species, desert pupfish, a very threatened species, birds of all kinds, rattlesnakes, which is crazy, tarantulas, lowland leopard frogs and other native leopard frogs as well, scorpions even, Mexican garter snakes, which are a federally threatened species, so that's definitely a problem as well, and Madrean alligator lizards. And this is just a shortened list of what they are actually capable of eating and have been documented to eat, which is crazy. So yeah, they can eat native amphibians, which is definitely a big problem. Bullfrogs are also a very mobile species. Because they're so large, they're able to move great distances. In the Southwest in particular, they've been shown to move up to 6.4 miles within 1 year. This is a very high number for a frog like them. The native amphibians in the area, like native leopard frogs, they do tend to move as well, just because they are in the same genus, but they don't move as much. It's usually like 1 mile to 3 miles a year. So this is definitely a huge amount, and especially in the Southwest, bullfrogs do move quite a bit more than they would in their more temperate regions where there's more reliable water and they don't have to they don't have to go that distance to find more water. But this really allows them to be able to spread out amongst any sort of watershed. And then lastly, bullfrogs have a very high reproductive potential. So bullfrogs can have up to 20,000 eggs per egg mass, and this is a picture of an egg mass here on the left. And they can also have multiple egg masses a year. So if you do the math there, that's quite a few eggs and then quite a few frogs that will come from those eggs. So once they lay an egg mass like that, or if there's multiple bullfrogs laying egg masses in these cattle stock tanks that are pretty small, they're usually not permanent water bodies, so there's not any predators in the system, then you end up getting scenes like this. So this is a seine net that was taken from a cattle stock tank here in Arizona. And all of those little blobs in the center, those are bullfrog tadpoles. So a lot of the cattle stock tanks can just become easily infested with hundreds or thousands of bullfrog tadpoles every single year. And then if you don't remove them like these people were doing, then the bullfrogs grow up to be juveniles and adults, and you get cattle stock tank banks that look like this that are just absolutely overpopulated with bullfrogs, which causes a huge concern because if you think about a native amphibian who only lays about 5,000, or I think it's 3,000 to 5,000 eggs per egg mass, and sometimes multiple egg masses per year, but they lay a lot less. And so if you can think about a little native amphibian in the middle of this mess, they're probably not likely to survive and be able to successfully reproduce with all of these bullfrogs around them. So my research in particular is hoping to learn more about these problems that bullfrogs pose and hopefully be able to predict more about what their behavior is going to be specifically in the Southwest. So I'm looking at both the dispersal potential and then also the reproductive potential. So I'm going to talk about two study goals today, but we're only going to start with one for now, the top one. So just ignore the second one. So the first study goal that we're going to talk about is to determine dispersal distances and the influence of landscape features like topography or drainages on dispersal, which is going to advise the design of buffer zones for bullfrog eradication and control. And I will talk about buffer zones in a second. So this study takes place in the San Rafael Valley. The San Rafael Valley is about 2.5 hours southeast of Tucson. It's very close to the border, and this has a very unique ecosystem, especially because it is one of the last native grasslands in Arizona. So you can kind of see from this picture in the center of the valley, you have the grassland, which is kind of more of a flat area. And then once you go up towards the mountains, it starts to get a little bit more hilly. There's more drainages. So there's a lot of interesting topography to look at here in terms of whether bullfrogs are choosing to move through those topographic variables or features, I guess, and or whether they're not. So I'm looking at different things they're trying to choose and then avoid as well. So the San Rafael Valley is full of those cattle stock tanks, like I talked about earlier. They're very interdispersed in this valley, and I'll kind of show a map of that a little bit later. But there's definitely two different types of stock tanks that we see. They definitely vary in habitat. So the left, sometimes we'll get cattle stock tanks that look like the left one, which is very lush in vegetation. It's got very beautiful water, lots of places for frogs to inhabit, hide, breed, whatever they want. And then we also do get cattle stock tanks that look like the one on the right, where it's just barren, there's no vegetation, just sticks and mud. And bullfrogs we do find them in both of these habitats. But the difference in the habitats of the cattle stock tanks provide a unique way in which we can kind of look at the difference between usage by bullfrogs of these different habitats. So before I talk about the actual methods of what we were doing, I want to talk first about why documenting dispersal distance is important. So let's say you have this hypothetical population of bullfrogs on this landscape, and each of these bullfrogs is its own cattle stock tank. So you as a manager, you look at this and you want to get rid of the bullfrogs so that hopefully eventually you can introduce some of the native leopard frogs back into the system. So that is what you do. So you're only able to eradicate maybe half of the population because these bullfrogs or these stock tanks are on private property, where maybe for some reason the private landowners really like bullfrogs and don't want to get rid of them. Or maybe this is across the Mexican border, so you can't, you're not able to manage that area. Nonetheless, you are able to get rid of bullfrogs in the right side. So then now you have ponds with no frogs in them, but then wait a few years and then you reintroduce some native leopard frogs. So each of the leopard frogs, again, is its own little tank, but you have this population of bullfrogs that's fairly close. And you don't want them to come back in and reinvade because they are really good at this. So it definitely poses a risk constantly. So what you do is you establish a buffer zone in between the population, the source population of bullfrogs and the eradicated area that you reintroduce leopard frogs to. So this buffer zone is really important because it, kind of breaks up the distance between the bullfrogs and the reintroduced leopard frogs. So why dispersal distance is important to know about bullfrogs is so you're able to kind of predict how far a bullfrog might move within a year and then adjust the width of that buffer zone accordingly. So you want to make sure that if a bullfrog, and they will get into the buffer zone, but you're able to capture them or get rid of them again before they continue moving through the buffer zone to eventually get to the population of leopard frogs. So the buffer zone does require continuous monitoring every year to make sure that the bullfrogs are not going to get back into the leopard frogs. But ideally, we want to use the dispersal distance that they can move per year to make sure that buffer zone is wide enough to make sure that that's not a risk. So getting into actually what we did this summer, this is a little timeline that I'll go through, and I kind of split it up by the dry season versus the monsoon season, just so you can kind of get an idea of the timeline that I was aiming for. So right in the beginning, we wanted to identify breeding and source populations. These are populations where there is a lot of frogs there, and they're also breeding, so they're going to continue having a large population. And usually, when you have a breeding or a source population, animals are going to be more likely to move out from those areas, trying to find new habitat and new territories. So we did that first. And then once we found those breeding and source populations, we wanted to mark all of the frogs at those breeding and source populations before the monsoon season started. During the dry season, they're not likely to move because it is dry and they're just they're at risk of desiccation. So marking them before they are expected to move was the goal for sure, so that we could document that distance. So once the monsoon season started, we started surveying the ponds that were surrounding those source populations, or the tanks, I guess. Tanks and ponds are kind of the same thing. And once we were doing that, we were hoping to recapture the frogs that we marked at those breeding and source populations as they move out from their source populations. And then we'd be able to record the distance that they moved from that original population. So this is another map just showing the actual study area that we were looking at. Important things to look at here is the 4 source populations that we identified right in the middle of the study area. These were, like I said, large populations of frogs. These would kind of vary from anywhere between 20 to 50 frogs, and one of them actually had over 300 frogs. So we had a bit of variation in terms of density, so that was kind of interesting to be able to look at those effects as well. So then once we marked all of the frogs at those 4 teardrop source populations, then we moved out to those blue dots and surveyed all of those to see whether we could get marked frogs from those source populations moving out throughout the landscape. So the bulk of what we did this season was definitely capturing bullfrogs. We did this in 3 different ways. The first way was using these minnow traps. These are collapsible minnow traps, which are usually used for fish, as per the name minnow trap kind of mentions. But so these were really great for capturing juvenile bullfrogs. The holes that the bullfrogs enter is kind of small, so we weren't able to get any large bullfrogs this way, but we got a lot of tadpoles and a lot of juveniles using these, which was great because we could set these the night before and then check them the next day, and it was a lot faster than hand capturing them. We did bait these traps using cat food, and we also tried some glow sticks. The idea with the glow sticks was that they would attract insects, and then bullfrogs would be attracted to the insects, so then they would be attracted to the trap. Another way that we trapped bullfrogs, so I was trying to get the large frogs because we couldn't get them in those minnow traps. So we use these traps, which are actually turtle traps. These are a big wire cage that kind of float in the center of the water. You can see with those like buoys on the side. So the idea is that a turtle or a bullfrog is going to walk up the ramp on the side, and then once they get to the top, it just drops them down into the trap. And we baited these as well. We actually didn't bait them with cat food. We just baited them with glow sticks. And unfortunately, we did not get any frogs with this method. But I think I have some ideas on what to try differently for next year. So hopefully they'll get some of the bigger frogs next year, but we'll see if that happens, trial and error. But the bulk of what we did and the method that was, surefire was hand capturing bullfrogs. So we did this using a spotlighting method, which is basically where we took a really bright flashlight and you shine it at the frogs and it stuns them so that you're able to kind of get close and grab them with your hand. This was definitely what we did the most, and it was the most productive. So that worked great. When you have a system that has over 400 bullfrogs in it, you definitely need a lot of help. I could not have done this myself. So I'm really grateful that I was able to hire 3 technicians this year that helped me all summer grabbing frogs, and they got really great at grabbing frogs. So if you ever need a great frog grabber, let me know. I have some contacts. We also had a lot of help from a bunch of different volunteers from various different agencies and also just from the University of Arizona. I was really lucky to have all of this assistance throughout the summer because when you get handfuls of bullfrogs like these, you definitely need a lot of extra hands to help process them and also help hold them. So the method that we marked bullfrogs using, that we marked all of those frogs source populations with, was toe clipping. So we would clip only 1 toe per foot to not inhibit any movement of the frogs. And this is a common method in terms of marking amphibians. So each of the source populations had their own unique mark. We usually did 1 forefoot and then also 1 hindfoot clip. These are very well healed clips on this juvenile bullfrog here. So each of the source populations had their own unique toe clip so that when we were capturing frogs at surrounding tanks and we caught one that had a toe clip already, we knew which source population it came from. We couldn't do individual toe clips because there's too many frogs. But yes, this is the method that we used. So the numbers of what we got this year, we did a total of 170 night surveys over this summer. We marked a total of 330 frogs at 16 different sites, and this does include the 4 source populations. We were also marking frogs at the surrounding ponds. Whenever we would capture frogs that didn't have a toe clip, we would just toe clip them there so we could get that just the between pond movement at some point. We had 6 flooded waders, kind of unfortunate, especially when you're working in cattle stock tanks, which are not the greatest water, but it happens when you're going to grab frogs and committing to it. And we only got 1 flat tire, which I think is not bad for remote 4-wheel driving all the time, but it was a pretty bad flat tire. So but gives a great opportunity for me and my technicians to kind of brush up on our flat tire changing skills, because it's definitely an important thing you need to know when you're doing field work in remote areas. Anyway, so let's talk about the results of the dispersal and movement part of my study. So this is what we found. We had a total of 5 recaptures, and these guys took 3 different paths. So interesting things to look at here. So the blue teardrops are source populations. You can see 3 out of 4 of the source populations here. And then the red dots are ephemeral tanks, which basically just means that those were tanks that just filled up during the monsoon season and were dry otherwise. So we did see movement here. Most interesting thing to look at here is that the southwest tank, the southwest source population, we had 4 out of 5 of the frogs moving from that tank specifically. That tank actually has a population of over 300 frogs, and they are mostly juveniles. So if you think about it from an ecology standpoint, if you have a really dense population, the individuals are most likely to move out from there because they're overpopulated and they want to find new habitat, new territory, especially juveniles because they are fighting for territory, so they want to go look out for different things. So that is what we documented here, is that most of the frogs that we saw moving came from that source population. So that was interesting. So we had 3 juveniles from that one move down to the different source population on the southern portion of the map. And they moved a total of 0.69 miles. And this is just a straight line distance. We don't actually know their path. And then we had 1 juvenile move from that large source population, 1.4 miles up to that ephemeral pond. And that was our longest distance that we recorded. So that was very exciting. And then, very interestingly, from a different source population, we had 1 adult female, and she moved a straight line distance of 0.7 miles, 71 miles. This was interesting to get a large adult female. She was quite big, and I'll have a picture of her in a second. But usually, you think of juveniles moving because they are looking for new territory. And maybe males are also moving because the bullfrog males, they have leks, so they tend to stay in one place, and any other males have to move and find their own lek. So it's likely that the juvenile males would be the most likely ones to move. So it was cool that we got an adult female moving kind of a big distance. Yeah, so this is kind of showing the difference between the sizes of the frogs that were moving. So on the right, that is the huge female that moved from that source population at the top down to the ephemeral tank. And then the one, or the juvenile on the left, that's the size of the other juveniles that were moving that we captured. That's kind of the size difference. So very interesting. So that big lady moved a long way. Oh, I also just want to do an honorable mention to this little one-eyed bullfrog. We captured him and he got toe clipped. So hopefully, we hope he makes it to next year so that we can actually get an individual survival estimate. That would be cool. Yeah, he's also just very cute. So anyway, what we can tell from this mark recapture study is that the frogs moved from point A to point B. They moved from their source population to wherever we recaptured them. And all we know is that straight line distance. We have no idea the path that they moved in between. This one, it's probably likely that this frog was moving up the drainage, which you can kind of see with that. I have no idea if you can see my cursor, but this blue line in the center that goes along that arrow, the juvenile probably most likely moved up through that drainage because there's more likely to be water, especially during the monsoon season. Whereas the other two, those straight line distances, if you look at them, you can see that there's steep slopes if you look at the topographic lines. And I can tell you just from being in the landscape that those are very steep slopes. There's a lot of ridges and drainages there that these frogs would have had to move over if they did move that straight line distance. So were they actually just moving that way? Or because, frogs don't have a GPS, so they're just kind of moving? Or were they being a little bit more targeted about it and using different stimulus to actually determine better places to be able to actually find water? So maybe they were moving down flatter land to find different drainages to move around. Maybe they were moving down drainages and then kind of around to different source populations. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that these frogs could have been moving, but we have no idea just with the mark recapture data. So what we're trying to do is use telemetry to actually find out what the paths that these frogs were taking was in between the ponds. So we marked we put transmitters on a total of 28 frogs. So they got these little transmitter harnesses, these little things on their backs, which we like to call their fanny packs. These are transmitters which emit a certain frequency that we're able to pick up with our equipment, which lets us know how far the frogs are from us. So we're able to actually track their movement at a finer scale than we were with just the toe clips. So we did this for about 5 weeks. We were going out there and using the equipment, which is an antenna and a receiver. This is what picks up the frequency that they are emitting on their little fanny packs. We did this for 5 weeks, 2 days a week, to kind of just determine whether the frogs were still in the pond or if we could get them when they were moving away from the pond. We weren't actually trying to track down the individual within the pond because that is a very impossible task, which we later learned. So what did we find from this? We found that it doesn't work very well. So we found that most of the transmitters, over half of them, actually fell off of the frogs. We had found all of these transmitters stuck in the grass. I think it was unfortunate that we chose a site that has such dense vegetation that the frogs, when they're hiding from whatever, they just get the transmitters caught on grass and then they fall off. So this was an unfortunate find. It was great that we got all the transmitters back, I guess, but this just goes to show that this is what happens when you try new things in research. Sometimes things work out, sometimes they don't. And, I always wondered why people weren't doing telemetry on bullfrogs, and now I think I know. So, lessons learned. So now we're going to talk about the reproductive potential part of my study. So we went over the first study goal of determining the dispersal distances and the influence of landscape features to advise the design of those buffer zones for eradication and control. Now we're going to focus on the reproductive study goal, which is determining the size at which female bullfrogs tend to be reproductively mature. And this is hopefully to advise eradication effort designs, which I'll talk about in a second. So when you're doing bullfrog eradication, definitely the first thing you want to do is to stop reproduction. Like I talked about earlier, they have a huge, high reproductive potential. So once they lay egg masses, they are able to produce hundreds of offspring. So this is a huge problem for eradication because once they turn into tadpoles, they're a lot harder to get rid of rather than just like single adults. So in the beginning of eradication, they typically try to target those large breeders, which makes sense because those are the ones that are probably going to lay the most eggs on and pose the greatest threat to eradication efforts. But something that isn't known is what size of frogs are actually still a threat for reproducing in the system. Maybe there's some smaller frogs that were being overlooked during the eradication, but they still should be prioritized because they still could lay an egg mass and pose a threat to this goal of eradication. So for this part of my study, this takes place at the Babakamari River. This is a little bit closer to those of you who know the Appleton-Whittell Research Ranch, just a little bit northeast of there. It's a bit further north than the San Rafael Valley that we were just talking about. It's right outside of Elgin and Sonoyta. Yeah, so this is a private ranch, and there is an eradication project starting out there this year. So this is the Babakamari River. It is an actual river. It does flow at certain times of the year. At other times of the year, it does have just intermittent pools. But this is a huge source population for bullfrogs in Southeast Arizona, which poses a threat to a lot of the Chiricahua leopard frog populations that are in this area as well. So the University of Arizona and Arizona Game and Fish were able to get access to this area for the first time this year to be able to start eradicating bullfrogs in this place to kind of eliminate that threat to the Chiricahua leopard frogs around this area. And I was lucky enough to be able to tag along with them while they were doing this first round of eradication and collect all of the carcasses that they were getting rid of, and then we would take them and dissect them. So that's what we did. We collected the carcasses. I want to give a huge shout out to my technician, Morgan McDowell. She definitely took the lead on this part of my project, which was awesome because I was definitely in the beginning of the season mostly preoccupied with the mark recapture part. So it was great to have her to trust in taking part in this. So Morgan was the one going out twice a week, every week in the summer to follow the eradication crew around and collect bullfrogs. So I'll just talk a little bit about the eradication that they're doing there. It is a really cool project, and if you want to talk more about it, Chris Pruitt at the University of Arizona is definitely the one to ask about. He is the one in charge of this eradication project, and and so is the Arizona Game and Fish. Anyway, so they shoot bullfrogs using a .22 rifle. They do this at night, and they use the spotlighting technique that we use for hand capturing, except they don't need to get as close as we do, which helps. They do this usually from the banks, and they also use canoes, which is really cool. So we would basically just kind of follow them around very safely, obviously, and we would take a net and scoop up all of the carcasses, and at the end of the night, we would take them and back into a cooler and then back to the University of Arizona where we did dissections. So for dissections, we had a total of 363 frogs that were dissected this summer, which is awesome. Again, could have done it without Morgan. Things that we were looking at for these or during these dissections were stomach contents, the size of the frog, which is the snout vent length, is how we measure that. It's basically just measuring the frog from the tip of their snout down to the middle of their legs or their vent. And then most importantly, we were documenting the ovarian stage of the female bullfrogs. This ranges from 0 to 4 and is based on egg size, egg color, and oviduct width. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So I am going to show a couple slides just showing the ovarian stages. So there are bullfrog dissection photos ahead. They're a little bit graphic. There's no blood or anything. It's just bullfrog guts. So if you've been in a biology class, you'll probably be fine. But yeah, just a warning, just in case anyone, so no one gets a jump scare. All right, so the first ovarian stage is ovarian stage number 1. This is a very reproductively immature frog. You can see the ovary I've circled with that blue circle. It is very small at this stage. It's very orange in color. You don't really see eggs differentiated within the ovary. So we see a lot of this stage in juvenile frogs, very small frogs. And then getting a little bit closer to reproductive maturity is stage 2. So this one you can see they start to get some developed eggs in there. Those black eggs are starting to come in. The ovaries are starting to kind of spread out. And you can almost see eggs within, but it is still yellowish in color, so not fully mature yet. Then you start getting to stage 3, which is where you start to become reproductively mature. This is definitely an early stage, but this frog will breed within the year. This stage is unique because you can see those eggs are definitely differentiated at this stage, but there's kind of a half and half of the white eggs versus the very developed black eggs, and the white eggs are just undeveloped eggs. So at this stage, they're getting close to being reproductively mature and a threat to be breeding within the next year. But stage 4 is definitely when they are ready to breed within the next month or so. So stage 4 is when you get the majority of the eggs within the ovaries as those black developed eggs, and the ovaries are very spread out. So this is a reproductively mature stage. So looking at the results from this, you can definitely see a trend that as the size of the bullfrogs increases, you get later ovarian stages. So they're becoming more reproductively mature as they grow up, which makes sense. However, if you look at stages 3 and 4, which are those later stages where they're becoming more reproductively mature, there's a lot of overlap between those values or those sizes of the frogs. So this kind of concludes that it's really going to be hard to tell the difference between a stage 3 and a stage 4 frog just by looking at the size of them. But, you know, you can see that point kind of on the stage 4 plot that's really high. That was our largest frog that we got. I think it was a little bit over 200 millimeters. So when you get a frog that size, they're definitely reproductively mature. So definitely still target the large breeders. But the smallest size at which we saw reproductively mature frogs was 123 millimeters. And I'll put a line here just to kind of show where that is in terms of all the other stages. So at this size, they can be reproductively mature or they could be immature. So it's kind of hard to tell. but probably safe to still get rid of them. So now I'll talk about the stomach contents that we found. So we found a ton of different groups, as you would hope from a generalist diet. We found a lot of crayfish within their stomach. There's a lot of crayfish at the Babakamari River, so that made sense. These are invasive species. We found fish, also non-native species like mosquito fish or sunfish, other centrarchids. We found evidence of mammal ingestion. This was just fur that we found, so I can't tell you what kind of mammal it was. It was black fur though. We did find evidence of bird within the stomach. We found feathers and then also possible body with organs, but it was heavily digested, so I could not tell you what kind of bird it was. And then the only herp species that we found was a snake, which I'll show a picture of later. It was a garter snake. That was exciting. Was hoping to get frogs, but we did not. Got a lot of plant matter. Bullfrogs are not herbivores, but I think that they were just getting plant matter from like the bycatch, if you will, from them just going for other things. They ate a lot of insects. Most notably, they ate moths and bees and wasps, grasshoppers, beetles, ladybugs. We even had a couple tarantula hawks, which was kind of crazy. But they're eating a lot of different varieties of insects. And of course, because bullfrogs are not the sharpest tool in the shed, they were eating rocks as well. So this is kind of a frequency table showing, we had a total of 363 bullfrogs, and you can kind of see by this that over half of them were either ingesting crayfish or insects, and then everything else was at a very low frequency in terms of finding it within the stomachs. But we definitely hope to add to this next year as well. So some interesting dissections that we had. One of them was this invasive crayfish that was huge. The crayfish was about 110 millimeters, and it was inside this frog that was 150 millimeters. So it's only a difference of about 40 millimeters between the size of the frog and the size of the crayfish that it ate, which is crazy. So I can't even imagine how much time this bullfrog was just going to sit there trying to digest that crayfish. And then this is the garter snake that we found. It was a black-necked garter snake. This is a common species in the southeast Arizona. So nothing too crazy there, but it was awesome to get a snake, and it was about 220 millimeters in this bullfrog that was 151. So what's the point of all this? What are the conservation implications from knowing all of this information? So working in the San Rafael Valley, we were lucky enough to see these kind of rare endangered species or just threatened species. So we saw a couple adult Sonoran tiger salamanders, which are my favorite. They are federally endangered. And then we also got to see a juvenile and adult northern Mexican garter snake, which are federally threatened. And when we find species like this while we're doing our bullfrog surveys, we definitely stop to think about why this is the reason that we're actually doing this work and who we're actually working to protect by doing this research. Another species that we're working to protect, and that a lot of people have been working to try and protect and bring back for decades now, is the Chiricahua leopard frog. This is a federally threatened species as well. They've had very significant declines over the years. And in 2002, before any conservation efforts were started, they were absent from over 80% of their historic localities. So a lot of people came together. So in 2001, this is a map of the distribution of bullfrogs versus Chiricahua leopard frogs. As you can see, huge amount of red just all throughout this map. And I will mention this map shows the non-urban areas of this area. If you had the urban map on here as well, there'd be a lot more bullfrogs, but this project was just based on the non-urban areas that they were trying to get rid of bullfrogs at. So you can see there's very small populations of Chiricahua leopard frogs here. So a lot of different agencies came together, they saw this information, and they were like, we need to do something about it. So notably, David Hall was definitely a huge part of this project. Arizona Game and Fish was also a huge part of many of these projects. And as of 2023, 2 decades later, this is what the map looks like. So you can see that they did a really great job at getting rid of bullfrogs in a lot of different areas. There are still threats to the Chiricahua leopard frogs, but there's huge populations now of the Chiricahua leopard frogs, which is awesome. So just to put you kind of in perspective, the Appleton-Whittell Research Ranch is one of those Chiricahua leopard frog metapopulations. That is right there. Las Ciénegas Natural Conservation Area is another with a lot of Chiricahua leopard frogs. Peña Blanca Lake area was a huge eradication project, and now there's leopard frogs there. And then the Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge is over there. So the Babakamari River is right there, right above the Appleton-Whittell Research Ranch. So I just point this out because it is super important that they're doing this eradication work now, because it is going to directly affect the or benefit the Appleton-Whittell Research Ranch Chiricahua leopard frogs, because they're constantly posing a threat to invading that area. And you can see actually that they have identified buffer zones. This took them 2 decades, so they did learn a lot about bullfrogs and their dispersal distance. So there's a lot that these people already know. It's just not published in the literature. So that's what I'm hoping to do. But yeah, so getting rid of the Babakamari frogs is going to directly benefit the research ranch and make sure that there's a buffer zone that's even greater around them. So when you're doing eradication, there's a lot of challenges. It's very costly. It can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $1 million per year. It's timely. It has taken decades, like we just saw, to do large landscape level eradications. And then there's always going to be continued monitoring afterwards. And then there's always probably going to be persistent invasion from source populations of bullfrogs on private property, across country borders, etc. So when you have these challenges, it's definitely important to make sure that you're doing the research beforehand when you're starting an eradication from square one. So if anywhere in the Southwest wants to start an eradication project, you definitely want to learn more about their ecology, kind of like my study, to mitigate these challenges and the costs and the time, and make them even more efficient and effective over time. And then I just want to end with this quote that I think is very fitting for this presentation today. It's by Jane Goodall, a renowned English primatologist. She says, "Fortunately, nature is amazingly resilient. Places we have destroyed, given time and help, can once again support life, and endangered species can be given a second chance." I really liked this quote, especially for this presentation today, because it just hopefully inspires hope that although bullfrogs are such a huge conservation concern, taking over all of these habitats, degrading them for native amphibians, that given with agencies, given the time and given costs and money and help, can hopefully eventually make sure that the leopard frogs or any endangered species can be given a second chance in new habitats. And so there is hope for the future. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge everybody that has made this project possible. I seriously could not have done all of this without the support and the advice from all of these people, and also the funding, obviously. So thank you so much to every single one of these people. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. And also just for the work. Bullfrogs are, I don't know, they're a frustrating challenge that has followed me through every conservation job I've ever had in Arizona.
Yeah.
And it's really cool that such dedicated work is happening.
Absolutely.
So thank you. And I think we'll jump to questions if you're okay with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Right on. So the first one that popped in early was, why are there no natural predators in the Southwest for this species?
That is a really good question. So there are some predators. They're actually invasive or non-native species here. So like big sport fish species like bass, or I can't think of any other fish species right now, but the big ones that have been introduced for sport fishing, those do actually eat bullfrogs, and they are a natural predator. However, in most of the stock tanks, there is not permanent water or water deep enough to actually have these giant sport fish species. So a lot of times the bullfrogs are just able to overtake those areas because they don't have those predators there. Birds also do eat bullfrogs, like herons. I've seen a couple of them pick them off, but at certain quantities, I think it's impossible to kind of control their populations with just a few species that eat them in this area. And I have also heard that bullfrog eggs in particular and tadpoles are impalatable to a lot of the species here. So they'll try to eat them, but then they just don't taste good. So that's kind of an advantage that they have.
Um, since bullfrogs need a permanent water source, do you expect that the recaptures that moved to the intermittent stock tanks will not survive?
That's a good question. I think that they kind of use those intermittent stock tanks to kind of move through the landscape to find more permanent water. So then as those intermittent stock tanks dry up during like this time of the year, I assume maybe they're going to move even further to find those permanent water sources. I do think a lot of them will probably not survive because it is just a very harsh environment for amphibians in general. But that's a really good question.
Oh, this is a good one. Because bullfrogs are eating the invasive crayfish on the Babacomery, do you think that the population of invasive crayfish will get out of control once the bullfrogs are no longer there?
That is a really good question. Yes, I do think that that will be a problem. There are definitely some species that also eat crayfish, like birds and around the Babakamari, but since bullfrogs are kind of the main ones eating the crayfish, I do think that that's going to be a problem. However, I don't think that that's really what they're trying to do with the Babakamari River. Like invasive crayfish aren't going to be a threat to native amphibians as much. And they're not trying to reintroduce leopard frogs at the Babakamari River eventually. They're just trying to get rid of the bullfrogs so that they don't pose a risk to the surrounding Chiricahua leopard frog populations. So, although it probably will, and hopefully, I think people are starting to pay more attention to invasive crayfish problems, that hopefully there's going to be some eradicating crayfish in the future, so that they can do that. And then eventually maybe the Babakamari could be a great habitat for native amphibians. But good question.
Maybe a future fellowship can support someone doing crayfish control work.
Yes, you should.
Um, this next one here, how did bullfrogs spread in different parts of the world? Um, and are there attempts to control them elsewhere?
That's a good question. So I think that it was similar for other parts of the world in terms of the people just wanted to introduce them to be as a game species for sport hunting. That was definitely the main thing, and for bullfrog legs, harvesting, and all of that. But in terms of if other places are also trying to get rid of them, yes, they are. There are definitely eradication efforts in other areas. I'm not super knowledgeable about what exactly they're doing in those areas, just because there is so many, but there definitely is a lot of research happening. I know even in, I think it's Germany or Belgium, they're doing a research on making bullfrogs that aren't able to reproduce. I think it's like the double Y chromosome bullfrogs. So that's kind of a really cool project that's happening right now. I think the results are coming out within the next couple years. So that will be kind of interesting to see the effects of that. So that's just one example that I know of them trying to control bullfrogs around the world.
That's really cool that, because while you were talking, I was thinking how fortunate we are to be dry enough that we can have buffer zones
Right.
and just places that I've been where bullfrogs shouldn't be that are just pond after pond after pond. And
Yeah. Yeah. There's
that could be a
definitely, we're
solution.
very
That's cool.
unique. Mhm.
All right. We got two more. First one, how did this fellowship, or I guess more broadly, your research experience this summer, help you grow or change as a student or future conservation professional? Any personal takeaways from the summer?
Nice. That's a deep question.
It
I
is.
think that this uh helped me grow a lot and change as a student just because that was my first field season. So managing a whole project and having all these funds to kind of supply everything that I was doing, I learned a ton about what it takes to manage a project this large and the time commitments, and also that when you're doing research, a lot of things go wrong and you have to be really adaptable to all of those challenges, which I definitely experienced quite a few of those. So I think this fellowship especially has been really awesome just to give me the space, especially now, to share my research and get this kind of feedback from the public about what you guys are interested in. And yeah, providing the funding that I was able to, we were actually able to stay at the research ranch, which was really cool, and be closer to our study sites, and yeah, just bond as a team, which was great. Really just showed me, yeah, what it's like to manage a whole team of people and be a project manager and all the challenges. So yes.
I feel like if you can handle flooded waders in a stock tank, everything else will be easy.
I
Um,
agree with that.
Actually, there's two more. They're easier
Okay.
ones though. First is, are there any other radio transmitter options to try out next year?
Um, there are, I think that there's different attachment methods that we could try. I'm not sure if we're gonna do telemetry next year just because I kind of determined that it wasn't going to be as informative as I thought it would be, and it did have so many challenges. Those are kind of the two main radio transmitters that everybody uses for all different amphibians. So there's not different transmitters really that could be used, unfortunately.
Bummer.
Yeah.
Um, and the last one is an easy one and a fun one. Have you eaten bullfrog legs, or did they all go to waste?
I have not eaten the bullfrog legs, but they did actually not go to waste because the owners of the Babakamari River Ranch actually wanted the bullfrog legs. So I don't know if anyone noticed the fact that some of the dissection pictures were missing legs. It's because we cut them off for the landowners, and they have, I think, like a big barbecue at the end or something to try them. But I wasn't invited, so I didn't get to try them. But I think it is on my list for next year. I'm going to request that some of them be kept for me so I can try them.
That's pretty great. Right on. Well, thank you again for being here and for all the things. For everyone on the line, just note that on November 6th, we will have our third and final webinar of this series. We'll have one of our students from Virginia talking about his really interesting work with ornate tree lizards. So thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Emma and Marlene, again for making this happen, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you.